Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being my Albany family for, oh my goodness, almost 20 years probably. And I so appreciate you guys. And it's amazing how the ones I've known the longest don't age either. Like Nate Lawson, he doesn't age. You still don't. You still look like somebody drew you, actually. And so it's just really cool to see all my friends. This is how, if you have less anxiety, if you know what's coming, this is how I picture the morning going, okay? And so I picture, it's 10:05, I picture 10:45, 10:50 or so will be done, just because I'm conscious of minds and butts and bladders and things like this. So we could take a break, and then we'll come back in and finish up. At the end, I picture a good Q&A time. Because the last thing I would want is for me to leave and Josh get 100 emails. What do you mean by that? Like, I'm standing right here, right? And I'm really approachable too. Like, I'm not like this jerk. But good Q&As are entirely dependent upon good cues. And so a good cue has a couple qualities to it. One, it's shortly stated. So 20 seconds or less. Two, it's a question, not an opinion. If you just want to spout off your thoughts about social issues or world events, that's boring. But if we want to grow together, that'd be awesome. Second, the third thing is that it's mutually edifying. In other words, it's not so specific to you that it doesn't apply to anybody else. And fourth, it's non-antagonistic. We're under a mandate from the Apostle Paul to do all things without grumbling or disputing. A dispute is anytime someone starts with their flag in the ground. I've tried to really discipline myself that if someone's asking for my help, that's one thing. But if someone just tells me what they're doing, I'm 49, I'm at least of average intelligence. I've never, ever been able to shift someone if they started with their own conclusion, right? But if we have shortly stated, mutually edifying, non-antagonistic questions at the end of this, it'd be great. All right, so also in the break time, myself and Yalda will be out there at the table. We have lots of series out there. And now it's all automatic downloads to all your devices, so you don't have to carry USBs or CDs or any of that anymore. We just give you a download card, and you have full access to the entire library and can pick it. All the sessions have, all the series have anywhere from 4 to 11 sessions, and they're the same price, so really, really easy. And if you don't know, if you're new to this, the reason we do that is two reasons. One, we want to resource people well. If your primary spiritual, psychological, or theological education is coming from TikTok, that's not good. What we do is we create a culture of ultra-crepidarians. That's my new favorite word. You can look it up. It's a real word, right? But it's C-R-E-P, not C-R-A-P, all right? So it's ultra-crepidarian. An ultra-crepidarian is someone who spouts off confidently about things they're not qualified to speak on. How many of you know a few ultra-crepidarians in your life? So there were certain things that sounded like a good idea, like let's give everybody a Bible. That sounds like a good idea until everybody had a microphone to talk about it. And now you have unqualified people making qualified statements. And that's not good. So we want to resource people well. The second reason is if you know me, just bear with me for a second. Some people don't know me. I love creating meaningful content that increases people's hunger for Christ, scripture, resurrection, hope, things like this. I do. And this is what I'm good at. That's it. But what I actually live for is for the poor and the afflicted. We have 3 orphanages in China that look after children with disabilities, 2 in Hinyang, 1 in Changsha. And so we're able to feed, clothe, shelter, educate children with disabilities with the money from that. We give them a regular amount every month, and then 3 or 4 times a year they'll call me and they'll have a surgery that I get to pay for. And I say that the right way, like I get to do this, right? Like it's like amazing. You engage a child's life with resurrection. Sometimes it's life-saving, like a surgery for hydroencephalitis or something. Sometimes it's life-altering, like a cleft palate. The most recent one was hip dysplasia. A kid was born and evidently the femur wasn't in the socket correctly. I think that's how it works. And so they had to break the leg and put it in there. And that sounds horrible, but you're crippled without that. And so this little boy will not be crippled. Matter of fact, I had dinner 5 weeks ago with a boy named Abner. And Abner is in 4th grade now in Detroit, Michigan. But when I first heard of Abner, he was born with hydroencephalitis and hip dysplasia. in Henyang, China. And we were able to pay for both surgeries. It cost $16,000. We were able to pay for both surgeries, and they saved his life. And then a pastor from Detroit and his wife adopted him. And he's now a thriving straight-A fourth grader in Detroit, Michigan. And this year ran a 5K. Yeah. So he inspires me, this kid, you know. I want to be like Abner. He's also a Star Wars expert. At dinner, he was educating me on, he said, you don't know much about Star Wars as I do. And I'm like, bro, you don't know who you're dealing with here, man. And I grew up with Star Wars. That joker knew more. And so it was really good. He said to me, he said, Pastor Shane, you have to read the books, not just watch the movies. I was like, okay, all right, no worries. All right, so let's talk about the Holy Spirit today. Tomorrow will be a sermon that'll be like really entertaining and all of this. Today is called Equip for a reason. I want to teach you how to build your life in the Spirit. What you build in the Spirit, you'll have in the natural. My problem with words like Spirit was that no one could define them. So when I was a kid, I had a disdain for it. Like, walk in the Spirit, live in the Spirit, build your spirit, pray in the Spirit. And no one could tell me even what that was, right? At best case, it'd be like, just pray in tongues more or something. It's like, really? Like, what? There's got to be more to it than that. I remember going to a youth camp one time, and the revivalist spoke maybe the second worst sermon I've ever heard. The first worst sermon I've ever heard was the guy that set the baby doll on fire and told us to come to the front. That was the worst. That's quite easily the worst. But this guy, what he did is, it was such lazy preaching. He took that passage, if you live in the Spirit, you won't fulfill the desires of your flesh. And then he just named every sin a teenager does. And the answer was, just live in the Spirit, right? Well, I was old enough by that point to ask him, what do you mean by that? And he said, Shane, living in the Spirit means as you're living, you're in the Spirit. I said, so he didn't know either. And I'm not mad at you. I'm not mad. If you don't know, you don't know. The problem is when you don't know, pretending you know, right? And so I had an encounter, a lifelong encounter with a guy that became my pastor named Clark Taylor. And I want to tell you two stories that illustrate what I'm going to talk about today. And they're two really hyperbolic stories, but they're both true stories. However, they're so ridiculous, I give you full permission to be skeptical and if you're skeptical, just see past it till we get to the principles. But there's a language in it. So I was with Clark one time. I was 21. I was his driver. So I was the youth guy, the youth intern that gets you go drive the guy, right? And so I was his driver. That ended up changing my life because as his driver, he would speak to me and he thought my insights were good, right? And so he said, do you ever preach? I'm like, well, I'm preaching at youth on Friday. And he said, come get me. I want to hear you. So this big international guy came to hear me speak to the youth group on a Friday night. Now, Josh, Bren, everybody can back me up on this. That does not happen, right? And as a result of that, he ended up in 2002 having me come do his pastor's conference when I was 26 years old. And that's what made a way for my life. And so this man's humility was unbelievable. Well, one time I went to pick him up and he had a heart attack. He had cardiomyopathy, ended up with a heart transplant, ended up becoming the longest heart transplant recipient survivor in the history of Prince Charles Hospital. Just this guy's faith was unbelievable. And so I went to pick him up and he looked terrible. He had this heart attack. I said, man, let me take you to the hospital. He said, no, man, this is America. You'll go broke, which he has a point about that. And I spoke out of turn. I was 21. I said, it's okay. The church will pay for it. They wouldn't have, I can tell you now. But I would have ended up paying for it. And so he said, no, just leave me with God, and I can sort my heart out. And I thought, wow. So anyway, there was a meeting on, and this was in like a Willow Creek church. This was not like a Pentecostal church. Like the word Pentecostal wasn't on the sign. I'll say it that way. And so what they did is they said, on the weekend, you do your thing, you preach, but don't be praying for people. Don't you do that on Sunday. No, we'll do something on Wednesday night, right? And Wednesday night, they just announced Clark was going to pray for the sick. Well, The place was, people standing on the back wall, and the sanctuary would have been about 1.5 times, 2 times this size. And just people standing on the back wall, but he can't hardly walk. So he gets up and he says, he read a passage that said Jesus went about doing good and healing people who were in distress or oppressed. And he said, tonight that's gonna happen, but I'm having a bit of a problem with my ticker, so I can't pray for everybody. I'd faint. He said, but can I pray for you, please? And it was a 16-year-old girl on the 4th row sitting in the aisle. She had cerebral palsy. And in no way am I making fun of her, but it was quite, okay, so with the wheelchair with the back on it. And I'm thinking, Clark, what are you doing, man? Like, you do that after, like in private, right? He goes, can y'all bring her up here? So the ushers pick her up, bring her up here. And over the course of 3 or 4 minutes, he just started speaking to different parts. He just, calm, still, still, still. Let's see if we can stand. Stood her up. She stood up. Her right leg was backwards like this. He goes, that's not a good look. And he turns it, and he goes, still. And then he backed off, and she was standing there normal, except her chin was way out here, like this. And he went, oh, sweetie, that's not a good look, right? I thought, what are you doing? Anyway, he took his finger and moved her chin back. She was standing there normal. And he said, have you ever run in your life? She said, no. He said, well, let's go. And now she was moving like she had never run in her life, but she started in a wheelchair, okay? The mom faints, right? She collapses, as you would. And he just had the ushers walk her back down. He said, now, how many of you have a problem in your body? Well, 85% of the room was like, I got a little bit of I got a problem, I think, And then he said, how many of you is your problem more severe than hers? Well, who's gonna say that, Yes, my raving case of hemorrhoids is really, no, right? It's like, no, come on, right? They're not gonna do that, right? So that he said, if it's more severe, I want you to sit back down. Here's the key line. I don't have space built in my spirit to hold that. I just don't have the space to have faith for that. But if it's less severe, I do. And then he just prayed for everybody at once, and it was mayhem. And then he looked at me, it was 30 seconds, and then he said, I think you're gonna find that you just got a touch from God in your body. He looked at me and he said, take me home. So I walked him out the back, had to kind of carry him. I got him to the hotel. He demanded I leave him alone. I did not want to leave him alone. And he sorted his heart out. That was in 1999, 1998. Years later, I have a friend who got a rare disease called pityriasis rubra-pilaris. It's a rare dermatological disease. Basically, your skin reproduces itself every 28 days. His was reproducing itself every 4 because his immune system thought his skin was diseased when it wasn't. To look at him was incredibly off-putting. He was red everywhere. If he was standing here, the skin would be this high, falling off of him. He was a good friend of mine. He asked me to lunch, and he said, I'm asking you to lunch because you've never judged me, you've never hurt me. I said, I will not. I'll do neither. He said, I'm using cocaine again. I'd been part of his journey where he had gotten free from addiction to cocaine. And so he said, I have to use cocaine again. I said, tell me about that. He said, it's the only, tears in his eyes, it's the only thing that takes the pain away. He said, the best medicine doesn't take the pain away, but cocaine takes the pain away. Please forgive me if that hurts you, but I'm using cocaine again. He said, can you get me an appointment with Clark Taylor? I said, of course I can. This dude flew from Charleston, South Carolina to Charlotte to LA to Brisbane in a plastic suit to not freak people out. He came in to Clark's office, and I was standing there, and Clark said, oh, man. He said, sir, I'm so sorry. You're so visually off-putting. I don't have the space built in my spirit to even have the ability to have faith for this. If I prayed for you right now, it'd be like me going blah, 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 blah. He said, but don't despair. If you'll give me 3 days, I'll build the space in my spirit to hold the faith for this so that the prayer can be effective. would you please graciously give me 3 days and forgive me for not being ready? I just didn't know what I was fixing to see. My friend said, sure, he stayed. And 3 days later, he walked into Clark's office. Clark, with no effort at all, just went, oh, there it goes, like that. This guy had a physical manifestation of definitely being touched by God. He was 280 pounds, and trust me, he got touched. And over the course of 6 days, starting at his fingers, his skin started coming good. All the way good. He went back to MUSC in Charleston, South Carolina, and showed himself to the dermatologist, and the dermatologist declared him completely free of pityriasis rubra-pilaris. When I was in Charleston, 6 weeks later, he came by my house, and he said, come on, buddy, you're buying me a drink. Now, as much as he had overcome his addiction to cocaine, his love for 20 beers a night was still there. And so I said, all right. He said, you're gonna be my designated driver. I said, okay. So I drive him to the bar. He lives at this bar. He's like Norm from Cheers, you know? And he's the guy that would be the least likely candidate for, like, if you have all these rules about who God heals and who doesn't, it just, Anyway, so we walk into this bar where he is the king, and he walks in the bar, and there's 6 guys, and they're like, you know, they're calling his name, oh, that rock. And he was fully covered, and he pulled his outer garment off, and he showed his skin. And the level of obscenity-laced tirades that was coming my way, I didn't know that certain words fit with other words like that. And actually, if you define them, it's like, what exactly is a stir-fried? Anyway, so you go there, and then he said, I was prayed for, and the power of Jesus Christ healed me. That is the beginning and end of what I know. But this is Shane, and he'll answer all your questions. And he's really, really rich. And so he's gonna buy all of our drinks for the night. And so I did. And I sat around with 6 people till 12:30 in the morning, talking about matters of the spirit with people who live in a bar. And they all in some way moved toward Jesus that night. Now, I tell you those 2 stories to use those phrases. In one sense, what seemed like the harder healing, he had built space for. I asked him about the girl. He said, I saw her in my prayer time at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and I started building space. He would use that word all the time. I'm building space in my spirit to hold what's going on here. In another sense, he didn't have it. And then I learned pretty quickly, basically, if you got lost at any of this, is that if you don't have the space built in your spirit to have faith for what you're believing God for, you're gonna live infinitely frustrated. And what I'm gonna teach you until noon, and don't panic, it won't go past noon, okay? Like I get it, like, man, how long is this gonna go? But what I learned from him changed my life. In October, off the top of my head, I was put in a position to talk about this. I hadn't talked about it in years, simply because I saw it better off as a, hey, let's me and you go have coffee, and I'll talk about this specifically situation. But I was put in a situation where I had to do it in public. And then the feedback was, you gotta write a course on this. This is life-changing stuff. And so I did. November the 8th, I recorded it. November the 10th, Clark Taylor died. And I feel like it's just time to release some of these words again. Before I go forward, if anything I say today detracts you from Jesus, feel free to ignore me. I would never do that. My goal is that Jesus gets bigger, the cross works better, the resurrection is central, scriptures get bigger, not smaller. And but I'm telling you, if you can only grab 2% of what we're gonna talk about today, it'll change your life. You'll be able to build space in your spirit. All right, so number 1, I'm gonna use my whiteboard at first. Number 1, we have to admit our limitations. People who aren't aware of their limits, they start living with certain mantras that frustrate their life. Like, you know, this is all up to me, or I've got this. Things like this that sound good, but actually, if you're honest about the fruit it creates, it's not producing happiness and joy and gratitude, right? Like people say, what's the will of God for me? Well, that's such a bad question. I mean, I love the way Paul says it. Give thanks, rejoice, and pray, for this is the will of God concerning you. So somebody said, do I want to be an engineer or a nurse? Well, do you like numbers or people? Pick one and then give thanks, rejoice, and pray, right? Or do I marry this person or that person? Well, pick one and then give thanks, rejoice, and pray. And depending on the quality of your choice will determine how much you give thanks or how much you pray. But our limitations, I stole this illustration from C.S. Lewis, but it's a really good one. Like, let's say I'm God, and you're all gods, and I'm the chairman of the council of the gods. So in this parable, I'm the Zeus character. And I say, let us make people because I'm bored with you. You're like, yes, we are bored with each other. Let us make people. So we make them on the whiteboard. And let us call them Joe and Jane. And let us make them in our image and in our likeness. And let us call them good. And at the end of the day, the problem with Joe and Jane is they're stuck on the whiteboard. Their entire understanding is limited to two-dimensional thinking. So what if I said, let's try to explain our ways to them. Let's see if we could do that. Let's see if we could explain our ways to them. And one of you go, sir, seriously, you're kind of in charge here, but they're not gonna get it. We have 3 dimensions of freedom. You can't explain 3 dimensions of freedom to people with 2 dimensions of freedom. They'll never get it at all. You're like, we're gonna give it a go. We're gonna explain it beforehand. Hey, Joe, Jane, hey, my ways are high above your ways and our thoughts are high above your thoughts. And if you try to figure us out, it's just gonna be a really frustrating endeavor. Our whole goal is for you to be so inspired by our kindness to you that you're kind to each other, right? But that being said, even the most amazing, ridiculously easy things in our world would blow your mind. Like in my world, I can be in front of you and behind you all at the same time. Well, to us, that's easy to see. To them, they'd be like, no way. Or even go simpler than that. Hey, Joe and Jane, in our world, I can extend my arm out, you know? Joe and Jane are like, or hey, Joe, Jane, in my world, in your world, that's a circle and that's a rectangle. But in my world, the same object can be a circle and a rectangle all at the same time. Like, that's a circle, that's a rectangle, that's a cylinder. You just need a 3-dimensional axis to spin it on. So these are the complications that exist when a 3-dimensional person tries to explain 3 dimensions to 2-dimensional people. How many dimensions does God live in? A lot. So how many more complications exist when an infinitely dimensional God tries to explain infinite dimensions to 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional people? And then the worst part is people get vitriolic. My problem isn't pursuit or curiosity. It's when people go, that's the only way to see it. And then when we do that, God becomes a giant projection of our preference, right? So we speak of God, we're saying God, Jesus, Bible, Scripture, truth, but what we mean is it's what I like with a giant megaphone. Like God is a big version of me. This is why Jesus Christ in Birmingham, Alabama looks different than Jesus Christ in Birmingham, England. Jesus Christ in Birmingham, Alabama is a Republican who wants everybody to have a gun, you know. Because Busta Cap said Christ, right? You know. The guy that told us to bless our enemies and pray for people who persecute us and to never set people on fire. Don't throw bombs at people. You know, that guy. Turns out, nope, right? And look, there's a reason in America to have a gun. Here it is, ready? I want a gun. The end. Everybody has one. I feel unsafe if I don't have one. Amen. But to go because I want one, God wants me to have one, that's projection. That's like this idea. Jesus Christ in Birmingham, England, don't want nobody to have a gun. And they love their free health care, right? And so it's projection. And that all comes from not admitting our limitations. And the inability to admit our limitations sabotages our ability to build our life in the Spirit because we limit ourselves to the things we can understand. The enemy of faith is not doubt. People, I just got to doubt less. No, the enemy of faith is sight. We walk by faith and not by sight. It's not, doubt sometimes can create the space where we ask the right question. It's when we can only go with what we see and what we can control. That's the problem. So number one is to admit our limitations. Number two is to watch our tone. 12 seconds here for the Bible nerds. If you're a Bible nerd, you're gonna love this. If you're not a Bible nerd, you're gonna endure this, but it's 12 seconds, okay? In Hebrew writing, they say, hey plus B plus C equals D. Now in English, we're done. But in Hebrew, they write it in parallel statements. If you're a nerd, it's called reverse concentric symmetry. If you're not a nerd, it's A plus B plus C equals D equals C plus B plus A. But basically, the way it works is the A connects to the A, the B connects to the B, the C connects to the C, and the D's the main point, which strangely looks like a menorah. Bible nerddom over. So the menorah was this defining thing around how the Spirit worked. And although there was one Spirit, the Spirit works in wisdom, tension. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge, and the fear of the Lord. I'm writing fast and my penmanship's not great, so give me a second here. Watch this. There you go. Wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge, fear of the Lord. Can you see how a later writer might say it's the fear of the Lord that's the beginning of wisdom? In other words, understanding your limitations is the beginning point to unlock your potential. But anointings work in tandem. Like, what are you if you have power without counsel? You're abusive. What are you if you have knowledge without understanding? You're useless. You know everything about nothing. You know, what are you? But the center candle that unlocks everything is called the servant. That no matter what anointing you're operating under, if it's not coming from the heart of a servant, it's fake. Even if it accidentally works, it's fake. It's so, the first thing is to admit our limitations. The second thing is to watch our tone, to watch how we're coming across to folks. Like, in my opinion, the worst thing to happen in the last 20 years is the availability for everybody to just spout off their opinion and without any consideration of how that's making someone else feel. Like, we're ranting without relationship. That doesn't make any sense. You haven't sat down and talked to anybody. Like, are you serious? Like, oh, and we're speaking of things, you know, that just don't matter. This happened in the foyer of a church, not this church, a different church, but it happened this year in a foyer of a church. Somebody came up to me and said, "Do you think Prince Charles is the beast of Revelation?" I was so disappointed because I'd just done 3 sessions and that was his question. I thought, I've wasted my life here. And so I just said, I was so taken aback by it. I said, oh, let me tell you a true story. I can answer, let me tell you a true story about a little baby that was born with no anus. And he was in Henyang, China, was left on the side of the road, and the reason he was abandoned by his parents was he didn't have an anus. And that's a very confronting thing, because of all the things you take for granted in life, a working anus has got to be up there, you know. And the doctor on staff at our children's home wrapped him up. It's a 2-hour bus ride to the hospital that could fix that. And they were able to fix it. They were able to connect the nerves. And 3 years later, upon subsequent examination, there's nothing else wrong with him. He's gonna live a full life, you know? And I said, there you go. The guy said, he was riveted to the story. He said, what's that got to do with Prince Charles? I said, oh, sorry. What it means is we should spend 0 energy on crap like that until every kid on earth has a working anus. Because when we don't admit our limitations and we don't watch our tone, we end up, in a problem. Third thing, oaths and judgments. Almost a year ago, I was sitting with someone that was brilliant. They were talking about the role of oaths and judgments in sabotaging your spiritual walk. It's just me and him sitting across the table. And I said, man, that's brilliant. Where'd you learn that? He said, from you. You did a series called The Pressure's Off in 2010, and you did 2 sessions on how oaths and judgment determine how you see your world. And then that ultimately determines how you build your spirit person. I'd forgotten I did that. And so it invigorated this thing in me around this. Here's the basics of it. In your family of origin, and then along the way, we get micro and macro messaging from our parents or through experiences. Like, so here's a common one, right? So in his story, his dad, who was a good man, was so scared of being impoverished because he had grown up impoverished that he would refuse to buy him shoes until his shoes were actually falling apart. Now, the micro and macro messaging in that is being broke is something to be very, very, very afraid of, right? And so this kid at 8 years old makes an oath. The oath was, I will not be broke. Second oath, it's up to me not to be broke. Third, judgment. Broke people are lazy and losers. So what this did, this oath and this judgment that just came from a dad who was scared to buy him shoes, this oath and this judgment then became the framework for which you start to see your whole world. So what happens is this person, I know him very well, this person found himself in situations working over 70 hours a week, and he's not broke. He won. He got what he wanted, but he doesn't have the joy of it, right? Why? Here's the reason why. Because anytime we're chasing something good, but the driver behind it is an oath or a judgment, to that level, it robs us of the joy of the thing we're chasing, even if the thing we're chasing is good. It becomes the filter by which we interpret everything that's happening. So here's some common ones. Let's say you grew up and your dad lied to your mother. Here's the judgment. All men lie. And then trust me, you make that judgment, the entire spiritual atmosphere around you draws men who lie. You will prove yourself right. Or let's say your mom cheated on your dad and you make a judgment. All women cheat. All women don't cheat. But if that's the judgment you made, there's all of these spiritual principles. Judge not, lest you be judged by the same standard with which you judge. In Deuteronomy, it says, if someone fails to make an oath, they will not sin. In Numbers, it says it's the father's responsibility at the family dinner table to listen carefully to the oaths and judgments his children make and make sure they cancel them before bedtime. Like this is like stuff, like I'm just telling you, and everybody's different. That's why it's hard to do a talk on this from up here, and it's easier to do it like this. But where you are in life right now is in some part due to the oaths and judgments we made along the way. The common ones are, I won't be broke, I will win, or I made a particular oath one time, just to be vulnerable. Somebody told me that I was nothing but a dime a dozen preacher that should belong on a street corner. And I think he was just mad at me and lost 25% of his IQ or something, I don't know. But he told me I was nothing but a dime a dozen preacher that belonged on a street corner. And I made an oath that day. Here was my oath, ready? I'll show you. And I did. But you know what? To whatever good I've pursued in the world, to whatever level that thing was still in me, is the level I lost joy on what I was chasing over here. Oaths, quite simply, are internal promises we make. And even if they sound good, when they drive the thing later, it's not good. Judgments are when we make calls like all women cheat or all men lie. Have you ever been sitting with someone and go, you know how men are? They're all full of crap. Careful. Unless your desire is to draw an entire group of men who are full of crap around you. Careful. Or all women, you know how women are. You know how they are. All of them. Can't satisfy none of them. No matter what you get them, they just want more and more and more and more and more. Careful. Careful. Sometimes it's a source of great humor. But sometimes it's the thing that becomes the filter by which we interpret our whole life, and that becomes our vision robber. It's the oaths and the judgment. So I just want to pause for a second and just ask you to consider this, because this would be different for everybody. And I don't want you to make up something that's not there either. But where have you made an oath or a judgment from childhood or going forward that has either enhanced your vision or hurt your vision? Like, here was a good one. Since I did a bad one, I'll give you a good one. I made a judgment early on that has helped my life a lot. I noticed that people who were the most successful were not the ones who worked the hardest. They were the ones who empowered the most people. They were the ones who had a profound trust in the most people to accomplish purposes. And they took the risk that those people would do them wrong, understanding that the level that whatever they lose by being done wrong will be overcome by a life of trusting others. And so I made an oath. I will trust as a default until somebody loses it. Instead of, I make people earn my trust, I start with trust because I learn. Now, has that messed with me a few times? Oh, yes. But what I've gained in the long haul certainly is outdone by the few times I've been done wrong. Same thing, this is not an oath or judgment, it's a good example. People ask me all the time, how much do you charge churches? In 22 years, I've never sent a church one bill. I've never sent a speaker fee. I only send my travel expenses if they ask. Thank you for asking. But that's the truth. And people say, aren't you worried about losing money? I'm like, I've lost money before. But what I've gained by having a reputation for being low maintenance and non-demanding actually has overcome that. But that comes from a filter by which I know if I trust people more than other people trust people, I can empower a team around me who will be more profitable, not less profitable, even though I'm taking a risk that someone will at some point do me wrong. That comes down to oaths and judgments. Like, there's so many scriptures in Ecclesiastes and in the wisdom literature about the danger of oaths. As a matter of fact, I think I could make a case that Jesus required us not to make oaths. Like, one of his key tenets in the Sermon on the Mount was, don't swear an oath by heaven or earth or its footstool or by God. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. So 1, admit your limitations. 2, watch your tone. 3, oaths and judgments. 4, let's talk about prayer for a second. I am so ashamed to admit this, but it's just true. I hated prayer. I was a fully devoted follower of Jesus. I was sold out to his purposes for my life. But when the pastor was like, we're gonna have a prayer meeting, I was like, oh no. But you couldn't say that out loud because you could get fired. So you're like, rock, let's do it. But I hated it, right? And have you ever made a promise you couldn't keep? Like, okay, prayer's important, I'm gonna pray for an hour a day. And so you're committed to, man, you're gonna rock this. And then like 2 minutes into your 60-minute prayer, you're like looking at the clock, like how much time? It's kind of like an exercise. Have you ever misjudged how long you can plank, you know? Like, you're like, that looks easy, you know? I'm gonna plank for 3 minutes, right? And 12 seconds in, you're shaking, right? You're like, oh my God, why am I shaking? I'm having a seizure here or something, right? It's that, right? And so Clark Taylor came to my church for 3 months. And our church had plateaued, and he was trying to, and what he found is that our church did not have any problems with programs or schedules or systems. He just said, none of you know how to pray. And so from August 15th to December 2nd in 1999, he met with us every day from 8 to 12 to teach us how to pray. It changed my life. I built my whole life this way now. And it works most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't work because you can't control other people, right? When you start using this kind of stuff to control other people instead of changing yourself, that becomes a real problem. So we're out by the Ashley River in Charleston, South Carolina, sitting on the banks of the Ashley River, just me and him. And he said, mate, what you build in the spirit, you'll have in the natural. I was like, rock, let's do it. He goes, we're gonna build your ministry in the spirit. I'm like, yeah, right? I'm 21 years old. I just want him to like me, to be honest with you. And so I said, how do we do that? He said, how else? We're gonna pray. I said, awesome. Inside, I'm like, I hate this. And he goes, you go first. Start praying. And I prayed the only way I knew how. Lord Jesus, we just come to you today. We're just gonna ask you now to bop, 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 bop. Man, I was barking at God about everything I knew I wanted, and it was amazing, articulate, passionate, loud, rhythmic, everything you'd love about a prayer, you know? Clark stopped me. He said, okay, let's just stop. It was 20 seconds in, 30 seconds. He said, all right, let's just stop. He said, that's the problem. You don't know how to pray. And I said, I know. He said, you're a fully devoted follower of Jesus that prays like a prophet of Baal. And that's a problem. I said, I know. I said, Clark, don't tell me. I hate prayer. I find it so boring, so boring. He goes, of course you do. If I prayed like that, I'd be bored too. Here's Jesus. And when you pray, don't be like hypocrites. They like to stand and pray in the synagogues, in the street corners, that they may be seen. Truly, I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you pray, go to your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who's in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. He goes on to say, and when you pray, don't go on babbling like the Pentecostals do. He said pagans. They're like, really? Wow. He said, don't go on babbling like the pagans do, for they think they'll be heard because of their many words and their expressions of need. Don't do that. Clark Taylor read that to me, and he said, so Jesus taught people how to pray not with words and not with needs. If you took all the words out your prayers and all the needs out your prayers, what would you have left? I was like, oh man, nothing really. He goes, again, you're a fully devoted follower of Jesus who prays like a prophet of Baal and wondering why you hate it. See, when Jesus said, don't go on babbling like the pagans, he's referring to a story in the book of Kings about a guy named Elijah. And Elijah was confronting these prophets of Baal. And the prophets of Baal were abusing people with spiritual authority, because you've never seen that in your life. People with spiritual power gain political power, and that becomes a problem. That's what was happening in that region. And so what they would do is they could claim that God could claim anything. They could claim God was saying anything, and what they did is they had a trick, right? What they did is they built an altar to Baal, and then on top of the altar was Baal, and then underneath the altar they dug a trench, and people could walk down there like the interns. But no one was allowed close. It was holy ground. You die. The only one allowed close was the priest of Baal. So the priest of Baal would say, thus saith Baal, whatever, right? And then if this be true, let Baal answer us by fire. And they could be saying, give us all your daughters, give us all your money, sell all your cows. They could have been saying anything like that. But this be true, let Baal answer us by fire. And all they did was they marched underlings under the altar, and on cue, they would hold up torches. So from a distance, it appeared like Baal was setting his own altar on fire to confirm the word. Now, if you have that kind of David Copperfield power, you could make people do anything. Elijah shows up. He's like, I'm tired of you manipulating people. Let's have a contest. Whatever God answers by fire, that's the real God. Well, the prophets of Baal, like, he don't know us, man. We know what we're doing here. He doesn't know us. They say, deal. He goes, oh, great, deal. Yeah, but not fire out of the ground. I know you know how to do that. Let's bring fire from the sky. And he changed the rules. And of course, with no effort, he just kind of does this guerrilla theater, and boom. And then he says, your turn. And then it says that in order to get their God to act, they shouted his name. They shouted his name louder. They sang and danced and turned in circles. They prophesied to the greatness of their God. When that didn't work, they shouted louder. They turned harder. They sang with all of their might. When that didn't work, they reverted back to the ancient art of cutting themselves. And in the middle of all that, Elijah's kind of making fun. Like, maybe he's on the toilet. Maybe he's on vacation. Maybe he's hard of hearing. Scream louder. So in that story, you have a group of people who, in order to get their God to act on their behalf, they shouted his name louder, sang and danced and turned in circles, and then shouted his name louder. Does that sound like anybody you know? It sounded like me. Probably sounded like you. And it definitely sounded like the way I was taught to pray. I was taught to pray by shouting louder, praising, turning. I was taught to pray like a prophet of Baal, even though I was a fully devoted follower of Jesus. And that became the problem. So does Pentecostal prayer toe the line of ancient pagan worship? Yes. But it's not about method. It's about motive. The prophets of Baal were doing this in order to get their God to act. Warlocks manipulate God to act on their behalf. Worshipers cancel the white noise of their week long enough to put themselves into the middle of what God is already up to. And that takes an extraordinary amount of surrender. It takes an extraordinary amount of idol-free approaches. It takes an extraordinary amount of that. So the question is, Shane, in 47 minutes, you just created a big problem. How do you solve it? So what do you do? All you've done is point out what not to do. Fantastic. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a break, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to give you tools that if you'll use them, it'll change the way you pray forever. And it'll allow you to build space in your spirit to hold the faith it'll take to do what God's called us to do. That was 47 minutes. I hope it didn't feel like 47 minutes. Thanks for being here, and I hope Jesus got bigger, the cross worked better, the resurrection central scriptures got bigger, not smaller. Let's take a break. Come see us at the table. Let me just say this real quick. If you don't want anything, God bless. But if you know you're going to grab something over the course of the weekend, doing it today really helps me because tomorrow is hectic, okay? So if you could do that, that'd be fantastic. Come back, and I'm going to talk to you exactly. I'm going to put real good, concrete language around what it looks like to pray like a fully devoted follower of Jesus instead of a prophet of Baal. All right, let's take a break.